Have you ever made one reckless decision that somehow led you to the person who would change your life? Looking back now, I can still hear the sound of shattered laughter, loud music, and my own heartbeat drowning out everything else. For the longest time, I told people the worst night of my life started with a fight in a neighborhood bar on the east side of Portland. The truth is, it actually started years before that, with 1,000 little moments I kept pretending didn't matter. My name is Ethan Brooks. I was 27, working evenings as a delivery driver while trying to save enough money to reopen the custom furniture workshop my late grandfather had once owned. Every paycheck disappeared almost as fast as it arrived. Rent kept climbing. My pickup truck rattled louder every week, and my dream felt like something that belonged to a younger version of me who had believed hard work always paid off. By Friday nights, I usually met my best friend Marcus at a local bar where nobody cared what job you had or how much money sat in your checking account. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about forgetting deadlines, overdue bills, and the uncomfortable silence waiting for me inside my tiny apartment. That night felt ordinary until it didn't. The place buzzed with baseball highlights playing above the counter, country music mixing with conversations, and bartenders moving like dancers between crowded tables. I remember laughing at one of Marcus's terrible jokes when I noticed a young server trying to stay calm while a frustrated customer refused to let the conversation end. The server kept apologizing with remarkable patience, but the tension in the room grew heavier by the second. Maybe I should have minded my own business. Maybe I should have looked away like everyone else. Instead, I stood up and walked over, hoping a calm voice might cool things down before anyone regretted saying something they couldn't take back. Unfortunately, I wasn't nearly as calm as I imagined myself to be. Weeks of bottled frustration slipped into my words, and before I realized it, both of us were talking louder than we intended. Chairs scraped across the floor as people stepped back to make room. Phones quietly appeared in a few hands, and the music suddenly seemed much farther away. Before things could spiral any further, someone behind the counter announced they had already called the police. The room fell strangely quiet after that. Adrenaline drained from my body, replaced by embarrassment. I rubbed the back of my neck and wondered how I had managed to turn another ordinary Friday into another story I'd rather forget. Blue and red lights reflected through the front windows just minutes later. 2 officers walked inside with the calm confidence of people who had done this hundreds of times before. One stayed near the entrance, speaking with the manager, while the other approached me without raising his voice or making a scene. He looked about my age, maybe a couple of years older, with neatly trimmed dark hair, steady gray eyes, and the kind of expression that somehow felt both serious and reassuring at the same time. His name tag read Noah Carter. He asked simple questions. What happened? Was anyone hurt? Had I been drinking? I answered honestly because lying suddenly felt exhausting. When the manager admitted nobody wanted to press charges and several customers quietly confirmed I had only stepped in after trying to calm the situation, Noah nodded almost to himself. I expected handcuffs. I expected paperwork. I expected a lecture that would leave me feeling even smaller than I already did. Instead, he surprised everyone, especially me. He looked at my truck sitting crooked in the parking lot and asked for my keys. I stared at him, confused. You're not driving tonight, he said in an even voice. And I don't think spending the night downtown is going to solve anything either. I blinked. So what happens now? For the first time all evening, the corners of his mouth lifted into the smallest hint of a smile. I'm taking you home, Ethan. I had no idea that those 4 simple words would become the beginning of the most important chapter of my life. The ride across Portland felt much longer than it actually was. Noah drove my old pickup while I sat in the passenger seat of his patrol car because department policy did not allow civilians in the front seat. The silence between us was not awkward, only unfamiliar. Every few blocks he glanced into the rearview mirror, probably checking that I was still awake and not regretting his decision. Streetlights reflected across the rain-soaked pavement, and coffee shops that had been full only an hour earlier now stood dark behind locked doors. I kept waiting for him to ask why I had such a short temper or whether I had a criminal record. Instead, he asked, "Do you always try to solve other people's problems?" I laughed quietly. "Only when I think I can." "And does it usually work?" I looked out the window. "Not really." He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. When we reached my apartment building, I climbed out and watched him park my truck beside the curb. The place looked even smaller under the dim security lights. The paint peeled from the wooden railing. One porch light flickered every few seconds, and somebody upstairs was practicing the trumpet badly enough to wake half the neighborhood. I expected Noah to hand me my keys and leave, but instead he walked over, looked at the front tire on my pickup, and crouched beside it. "You know this tire is almost bald, right?" he asked. "I know," I admitted. "New tires cost money." He stood again without another lecture and simply handed me the keys. "Get some sleep, Ethan. Tomorrow will look different." I almost asked him why he had trusted me, but the words never came. He tipped his head in a quiet goodbye, climbed back into his cruiser, and disappeared around the corner. The next morning I woke with a headache that had nothing to do with alcohol. Embarrassment lingered longer than any hangover. Marcus had already left 3 voice messages asking whether I had survived jail. I called him back while making burnt toast. He laughed for nearly a full minute after I explained that a police officer had driven me home instead. "Either you met the nicest cop in Oregon," he said, "or you accidentally became the star of the weirdest Hallmark movie ever made." I rolled my eyes, but I laughed anyway. By Monday morning, life had settled back into its usual rhythm. I loaded cabinets and dining tables into my pickup for deliveries, navigated traffic across the city, and tried not to think about Friday night. The only reminder was a business card tucked inside my wallet. Noah had slipped it there before leaving. On the back, he had written only 6 words. "Replace that front tire this week." I still do not know why I kept the card. Maybe because nobody had shown concern without expecting something in return for a very long time. 3 days later, my route changed unexpectedly. One of my regular deliveries was redirected to a neighborhood community center where volunteers were renovating classrooms for an after-school woodworking program. I carried in a stack of oak shelves and froze the moment I recognized a familiar voice thanking another volunteer. Noah stood near the entrance wearing jeans, work boots, and a faded blue sweatshirt instead of his uniform. Safety glasses rested on top of his head while he helped an elderly man measure lumber for new bookshelves. He looked completely different without the badge. Less intimidating, more real. He noticed me at almost the same moment. "Ethan," he said with mild surprise, "looks like your tire survived." I looked down instinctively before realizing he was teasing me. "Barely," I answered. "I have an appointment tomorrow." "Good." He smiled, and this time it lasted long enough for me to notice the tiny crease near his left eye. We spent the next 15 minutes carrying supplies into the building while exchanging short conversations about woodworking, old houses, and how impossible Portland traffic had become. I learned he volunteered there every Wednesday on his day off because his grandfather had taught shop classes before retiring. He learned I had grown up building furniture with mine. The conversation flowed with an ease that caught me off guard. There was no tension from the bar, no judgment, no reminder that our first meeting had happened on one of my worst nights. As I prepared to leave, one of the volunteers accidentally dropped a box of donated books across the sidewalk. Before either of us could react, both Noah and I bent down at exactly the same time, reaching for the same hardcover novel. Our hands bumped lightly, and we both pulled back with the same awkward apology before laughing at ourselves. It was a tiny moment, ordinary enough that anyone else would have forgotten it before dinner. I remembered it for weeks. As I drove away that afternoon, I caught myself smiling at a red light for absolutely no reason, and that confused me almost as much as the fact that somewhere across town, a police officer who had every reason to write me off as another troublemaker had instead become the first stranger in years who made the city feel just a little less lonely. Over the next few weeks, Wednesday quietly became my favorite day without me fully realizing why. My delivery schedule often took me within a few blocks of the community center, and if I happened to finish early, I always seemed to find a reason to stop by. Sometimes I brought leftover wood samples from work because the after-school program could use them for beginner projects. Other times I claimed I was only checking whether the shelves we had carried inside were holding up. The truth was much simpler. I enjoyed spending time there, and somewhere between sanding rough boards and carrying boxes, I had started looking forward to seeing Noah. What surprised me most was how different he was outside of his uniform. He laughed more than I expected, especially when the middle school students proudly showed off crooked birdhouses that looked ready to collapse before they ever reached a tree. He never corrected them harshly. Instead, he asked questions that helped them discover their own mistakes. Watching him patiently explain how to hold a measuring tape reminded me that kindness was a skill just like woodworking. It had to be practiced every day. One afternoon, I arrived with several bundles of maple lumber tied down in my truck bed. Noah was already unloading folding tables from a trailer parked beside the building. Before I could offer to help, one of the tables slipped from his hands and landed flat on the pavement with a loud clatter. He stared at it for a second before shrugging. That sounded more expensive than it actually was. I laughed. That might be the calmest reaction I have ever seen. He grinned. Being dramatic has never fixed a broken table. Together we carried everything inside, joking about whose back would complain more the next morning. It was easy. So easy that I almost forgot how awkward our first meeting had been. As the volunteers gathered for lunch, an elderly woman named Linda insisted everyone take homemade chili and cornbread before returning to work. Noah handed me a bowl without asking whether I wanted one, as though he already assumed I would stay. Somehow that small gesture made me feel included in a way I had not experienced for years. During lunch, the conversation drifted toward hobbies. One volunteer collected vintage baseball cards. Another restored old bicycles. When someone asked Noah what he enjoyed outside of work, he hesitated before answering. Cooking, he finally admitted. The room immediately filled with playful teasing. One volunteer joked that no police officer should know the difference between fresh rosemary and dried thyme. Noah accepted every joke with an easy smile before looking toward me. What about you? He asked. Still building furniture? I nodded. Whenever I can afford the wood. What would you build if money did not matter? The question caught me completely off guard. Nobody had asked me about my dream in years. Most people wanted to know how much something cost or how quickly I could deliver it. No one wanted to know what I actually wanted to create. I looked around the workshop before answering. Dining tables, I said quietly. The kind families keep for 30 years. The kind where birthdays happen and homework gets finished and grandparents tell the same stories every Thanksgiving. Noah smiled in a way that made me feel as though my answer mattered. Sounds like you are not really building furniture, he said. Sounds like you are building places where people remember each other. I thought about those words all the way home. They stayed with me longer than I expected. A few days later, the city held its annual neighborhood street fair. Food trucks lined several blocks. Local musicians performed on temporary stages, and artists displayed handmade crafts beneath colorful tents. Marcus convinced me to go even though I insisted crowds were not really my thing. We had barely finished buying lemonade when I spotted Noah helping a little girl reunite with her worried parents near the information booth. Once the family walked away smiling, he noticed me standing nearby. You planning to rescue anyone today? He asked with a playful smile. I was hoping to avoid needing rescue myself, I answered. Marcus looked from me to Noah with an expression that practically screamed curiosity before inventing an excuse to disappear toward a barbecue stand. I silently promised myself I would never forgive him. Noah laughed as if he understood exactly what had happened. We spent the next hour wandering through the fair together, sampling fresh kettle corn, listening to a local folk band, and debating which booths sold the best coffee beans. Conversation never felt forced. We talked about childhood memories, favorite movies, and the strange satisfaction of fixing something with our own hands. At one point, we stopped beside a booth where children were painting small wooden birdhouses. One little boy accidentally smeared blue paint across the front of his shirt and looked ready to cry. Without hesitation, Noah crouched beside him and said, "That just means you worked hard enough to make something worth remembering." The boy laughed almost instantly. Watching that simple exchange, I realized something that caught me completely by surprise. The first thing I had noticed about Noah was his badge. The thing I admired most now had absolutely nothing to do with it. By the time autumn settled over Portland, our conversations no longer depended on chance. We exchanged messages about ordinary things that somehow became the best part of my day. Noah would send a picture of a loaf of bread that had risen better than expected, and I would reply with a photo of a walnut tabletop I had finally finished sanding. He teased me for drinking too much coffee. I reminded him that nobody should voluntarily wake up before sunrise on a day off. The conversations never tried too hard to be meaningful, yet they quietly stitched two separate lives together. One Wednesday evening, after another volunteer session at the community center, rain began falling so heavily that nobody wanted to drive immediately. Linda insisted everyone stay for homemade soup until the weather calmed down. We crowded around the small kitchen, laughing over old stories while thunder rolled outside. When most of the volunteers finally headed home, Noah noticed me staring through the window toward the parking lot. "Your windshield wipers are barely keeping up," he said. "You can wait another hour if you want." I shrugged. "I have nowhere I need to be." He smiled. "Then help me clean up." We washed dishes side by side, dried tables, folded chairs, and swept the workshop floor. Somehow those simple tasks felt more satisfying than anything I had done all week. Before locking the building, Noah asked if I had eaten enough. I admitted that one bowl of soup hardly counted as dinner after carrying lumber all afternoon. "Come over," he said casually. I was already planning to cook. "It is only 15 minutes away." I hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before agreeing. Noah lived in a modest craftsman house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The front porch held 2 rocking chairs, several healthy potted plants, and a wind chime that sang softly whenever the breeze picked up. Inside, the house felt warm without trying to impress anyone. Books filled one wall of the living room, framed landscape photographs decorated the hallway, and the kitchen smelled like fresh garlic and rosemary. "Make yourself useful," Noah said as he handed me a cutting board. "Slice the mushrooms." "You trust me with a knife after our first meeting?" I asked. He laughed. "I trust you more now than I did then." We cooked together with surprising ease. He prepared a simple pasta with roasted vegetables, while I mixed a salad from whatever he already had in the refrigerator. There was no fancy music, no expensive wine, no dramatic moment that belonged in a romantic movie. We simply talked. We shared stories about childhood camping trips, favorite teachers, embarrassing first jobs, and the grandparents who had shaped both of our lives. I realized hours had passed without either of us checking a phone. After dinner, we moved to the living room with mugs of hot tea while rain continued tapping against the windows. Noah showed me an old photo album filled with pictures from volunteer construction projects he had joined over the years. Every photograph carried the same quiet pattern. He never stood in the center. He always seemed happier helping someone else shine. As the evening grew later, the weather report warned that several roads had flooded and advised people to stay off the streets until morning. I stood and reached for my jacket anyway. Noah looked outside before shaking his head. "You really should not drive in this." "I do not want to inconvenience you." "You are not." He pointed toward the hallway. "The guest room is being painted, so it is full of furniture. The bed in my room is a queen size. We can both get some sleep without anyone falling onto the floor." I looked at him for a moment before nodding. The suggestion felt practical, nothing more, and I trusted him completely. We brushed our teeth, laughed over the fact that he kept spare toothbrushes for visiting relatives, and settled into opposite sides of the bed fully dressed in comfortable clothes after he lent me a clean t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. There was plenty of space between us, yet somehow the room felt unusually peaceful. The only sound came from steady rain outside and the occasional creak of the old house settling for the night. We talked quietly in the dark about everything and nothing. He admitted he still missed his grandfather every time he cooked one of his recipes. I confessed that I sometimes worried I had waited too long to chase my dream of opening a furniture shop. "You still talk about it like it is possible," Noah said softly. "That tells me you have not given up." I stared at the ceiling for a long moment before answering. Maybe I have just been waiting for someone to believe it could happen. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Finally, Noah said, almost in a whisper, "I do." Those 2 simple words settled into the silence between us with a warmth I had not expected. We wished each other good night, turned off the bedside lamp, and fell asleep. Beneath the same roof, separated only by a few feet of mattress, but somehow feeling much closer than either of us was ready to admit. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the bedroom curtains, painting soft golden lines across the ceiling. I woke slowly, confused for a second by the unfamiliar room, until the smell of fresh coffee drifted down the hallway. For a moment, I simply lay there, listening. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan gently sizzled, cabinet doors opened and closed, and an old jazz record played quietly in the background. It was the kind of peaceful morning I had almost forgotten existed. When I finally walked into the kitchen, Noah was standing at the stove wearing jeans and a faded gray sweatshirt, flipping blueberry pancakes with the confidence of someone who had made the same breakfast 100 times before. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Good morning. I was beginning to think you slept through winter." I laughed as I accepted the mug of coffee he offered. That might be the best compliment anyone has ever given my sleeping habits. We ate breakfast at the small wooden table beside the kitchen window while rainwater still clung to the maple leaves outside. The conversation wandered naturally from favorite diners to terrible apartment landlords, and before I realized it, I had stayed nearly 2 hours longer than I intended. As I stood to leave, Noah disappeared into the hallway and returned carrying a small cardboard box. "I found these while cleaning the garage last month," he said. Inside were several vintage woodworking chisels, carefully wrapped in old newspaper. "They belonged to my grandfather. I cannot use them the way he did, but I think someone should." I looked at the tools without touching them. "I cannot take these." "You are not taking them forever," he replied. "Think of it as borrowing until you build that first dining table you keep talking about." His faith in me felt heavier than the box itself. I accepted it with quiet gratitude, promising to take good care of every piece. Over the following weeks, those chisels became part of my daily routine. After finishing deliveries each afternoon, I spent several hours in the small storage garage behind my apartment building, slowly restoring an old walnut table I had rescued from a yard sale. Every evening, I sent Noah photographs showing the progress. Sometimes he replied with practical suggestions. Other times he simply wrote, "Keep going. It already looks better than yesterday." Those 4 words somehow motivated me more than compliments ever could. Then, just as life began settling into a comfortable rhythm, the past quietly knocked on my door. One afternoon, I returned home to find a familiar sedan parked outside my apartment. My older brother Ryan leaned against the hood with his hands in his pockets. We had not seen each other in almost 2 years. Growing up, Ryan had always believed practical choices mattered more than impossible dreams. After our grandfather passed away and the workshop closed, he encouraged me to sell every remaining tool and find a stable office job. When I refused, our conversations slowly disappeared until silence became easier than disagreement. Seeing him standing there felt like reopening a chapter one had carefully placed on the highest shelf. He smiled awkwardly as I approached. "You still look like sawdust follows you everywhere." "Occupational hazard," I answered with a small smile. We grabbed coffee at a nearby cafe, and for a while conversation stayed safely on familiar subjects. Family, weather, work. Eventually his eyes drifted toward my calloused hands resting on the table. "You are still chasing the furniture shop?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed gently, not with disappointment, but concern. "I worry that you keep putting your whole life on hold for something that might never happen." Normally those words would have started another argument, but this time they only made me tired. Before I could answer, the cafe door opened and Noah stepped inside, still wearing his patrol uniform after finishing an early shift. He spotted me immediately, then noticed Ryan sitting across from me. Instead of interrupting, he gave me a friendly wave and walked toward the counter to order coffee. Ryan quietly watched the exchange before looking back at me. "Friend?" he asked. I smiled without thinking. "Yes. Hey, good one." Ryan studied my expression for a moment and smiled in a way I had not seen since we were teenagers. "Whoever he is," he said softly, "you look different." "Different how?" He leaned back in his chair. "Lighter. Like you finally stopped carrying everything by yourself." Those words stayed with me long after Ryan drove away. Later that evening, Noah and I walked through the neighborhood park beneath trees painted orange and red by early fall. I finally told him about my brother, about losing the workshop, and about how every unfinished dream had slowly convinced me that disappointment was simply part of growing older. Noah listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he looked across the river before saying quietly, "Sometimes people confuse protecting us from failure with protecting us from hope. They are not the same thing." I realized then that the greatest gift Noah had given me was not encouragement or advice. It was permission to believe that my future did not have to be limited by my past. As October slipped toward November, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to question. Every Wednesday evening belonged to the community center. Saturday mornings often began with coffee at the small cafe overlooking the river, where Noah always ordered plain black coffee, while I insisted flavored creamers deserved more respect than they received. He claimed I drank dessert instead of coffee. I reminded him that happiness sometimes came in a paper cup with caramel foam. Those playful arguments became our tradition, and the barista eventually stopped asking for our orders because she already knew them by heart. One crisp Saturday afternoon, we wandered through a neighborhood farmer's market searching for fresh apples because Noah insisted they were perfect for homemade pie. Halfway through the market, we passed a booth where local artists displayed handcrafted furniture. I slowed almost immediately, admiring the smooth walnut grain on a dining table positioned near the entrance. The elderly craftsman noticed my interest and invited me to take a closer look. We spent nearly 20 minutes discussing joinery techniques, wood finishes, and how certain tables were built to last for generations instead of seasons. Noah stood quietly nearby, smiling as though he enjoyed watching someone else become excited about something they loved. As we walked away, he asked, "Did you notice how differently you talk when you are discussing woodworking?" I frowned. "Differently. You stop worrying about sounding impressive," he replied. "You just become yourself." His observation lingered with me for the rest of the afternoon. A few days later, Noah invited me to dinner again, this time with a challenge. No takeout. No shortcuts. We both cook. The result was far from perfect. I accidentally added too much pepper to the roasted vegetables, and he nearly forgot the bread in the oven because we became distracted arguing over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. We laughed so hard that dinner ended nearly 40 minutes later than planned. After we finished eating, we carried our mugs of tea onto the back porch. The air had turned cold enough that we wrapped ourselves in separate blankets while watching leaves drift across the yard. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable, like a conversation that did not need words. Finally, Noah broke it with an unexpected question. "Can I tell you something I do not usually tell people?" I nodded. He rested his mug on the porch railing before speaking. "About 4 years ago, my partner on the department died from an illness that progressed much faster than anyone expected. We were never romantically involved, but he was my closest friend. We spent almost every day working together. After he was gone, I convinced myself it was easier not to let anyone get too close again. You cannot lose what you never allow yourself to have." His voice remained steady, but I could hear the weight behind every sentence. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. "I think I did something similar," I said quietly. "Not because someone died. Because every time a dream disappeared, I told myself not to hope so much next time." Noah looked toward me. "Has that worked?" I smiled sadly. "Not even a little." He laughed softly. "Me? Neither." The porch light cast a warm glow across the quiet yard as we sat there sharing stories we had hidden from almost everyone else. It felt less like confessing painful memories and more like carefully placing them down so neither of us had to carry them alone anymore. Before I left that evening, Noah walked me to my truck as he always did. We stood beside the driver's door for a moment, neither of us seeming eager to end the night. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something important, then paused. Instead, he smiled. "Drive safely, Ethan. You too." I answered, even though he was already home. As I pulled away, I caught him standing beneath the porch light until my truck disappeared around the corner. The following week brought an unexpected surprise. My supervisor called me into the office and explained that a local restaurant chain needed custom tables for 2 newly renovated locations. They wanted handcrafted pieces instead of factory furniture, but our company did not have anyone specializing in that kind of work. Before I could even process what he was suggesting, he slid the paperwork across the desk. "You have been talking about furniture for months," he said. "If you want the project, it is yours after regular delivery hours." I drove straight to Noah's house without calling first. When he opened the front door, I could barely contain my excitement. He listened as I explained every detail, then broke into the widest smile I had ever seen on his face. Without saying a word, he disappeared into the kitchen and returned holding the old woodworking chisels his grandfather had once owned. He placed them gently into my hands and said, "Looks like it is finally time to stop borrowing them." At that moment, I realized something that frightened me almost as much as it filled me with hope. Somewhere between shared breakfasts, quiet evenings, ordinary conversations, and believing in each other's impossible dreams, Noah had quietly become the first person I wanted to tell whenever life gave me a reason to smile. The custom table project quickly transformed my evenings into a careful balance between exhaustion and excitement. I spent my mornings making deliveries, my afternoons sketching designs, and most nights shaping walnut and white oak inside the rented workshop behind my apartment building. Every cut felt like another small step toward the future I had almost stopped believing in. Noah became my unofficial quality inspector. Whenever his schedule allowed, he stopped by after work carrying 2 cups of coffee and enough encouragement to erase an entire day's worth of self-doubt. He never pretended to know more about woodworking than I did, but he always noticed the details that mattered. "This edge feels smoother than the last one," he would say while running his fingertips gently across the finished surface. Or he would stand back, studying a nearly completed table before quietly adding, "I can already imagine a family sitting here every Sunday." Somehow he always reminded me why I had started. One Friday evening we stayed at the workshop later than usual. Soft music played from an old radio in the corner, while the scent of freshly cut wood filled the room. Noah helped sweep away piles of sawdust as I applied the final coat of finish to the first completed dining table. When I stepped back to admire it, neither of us spoke for several seconds. It was not perfect. A craftsman always notices tiny flaws no one else can see. But it was real. I had built it with my own hands. Noah broke the silence first. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." I swallowed hard because hearing those words from him somehow meant more than I expected. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was my supervisor. The restaurant owners had seen progress photos and wanted to expand the order. Instead of 12 tables, they now wanted 18, along with matching benches. I should have felt nothing but excitement, yet the first emotion that arrived was panic. More materials, more hours, more pressure, more chances to fail. After I hung up, Noah noticed the change in my expression immediately. "What happened?" he asked. I explained everything, ending with a frustrated sigh. Maybe this is too much. Maybe I accepted more than I can actually do. Noah leaned against the workbench with his arms folded. "Do you remember what you told me the first time we worked together at the community center?" I frowned. Probably something embarrassing. He laughed. "You said every project looks impossible until someone finishes the first piece. Then the second one becomes easier." I stared at him for a second before laughing myself. "I actually said that." "You did." He smiled. "Maybe it is time to believe your own advice." The following Monday brought another unexpected conversation. Noah called while I was loading lumber into my truck and asked if we could meet after work. His voice sounded calm, but something beneath it felt unusually serious. We met at our favorite riverside cafe just before sunset. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup before speaking. "My captain offered me a promotion." I smiled immediately. "That is incredible." He nodded, but his expression never changed. "The position is in Seattle." The smile faded from my face before I could stop it. Seattle was only about 3 hours away, yet it suddenly felt much farther. He continued quietly. "Nothing is final. I have not accepted it." I looked across the river, watching small boats drift through the fading light. "You should take it if it is what you want." "That is the problem," he admitted. "A few months ago the answer would have been easy. Now it is not." Neither of us said the thing we were both thinking. We had never defined whatever existed between us. We had never called it friendship or anything more. We had simply continued choosing each other's company, one ordinary day after another, until those ordinary days became important. Over the next week, an unfamiliar distance quietly settled between us. We still exchanged messages, but they grew shorter. We still met at the community center, yet both of us seemed careful not to linger after everyone else left. It was not anger. It was uncertainty. We were both trying to protect something we had never found the courage to name. Then, on Wednesday evening, Linda noticed the silence almost immediately. She watched Noah leave early for an unexpected call before walking over to me with a knowing smile. "You know," she said while arranging paintbrushes into a box, "people spend too much time waiting for perfect timing. Most of the happiest moments in my life happen because someone finally said what they were afraid to say." I smiled politely, but her words followed me all the way home. That night, I stood alone in my workshop, looking at the finished dining table illuminated by a single overhead light. Months earlier, I had been afraid to begin because I thought I might fail. Now I realized I was making the exact same mistake somewhere else in my life. Building something meaningful always required risking disappointment. Whether it was a handcrafted table or a place in someone else's heart, there came a moment when careful planning had to give way to simple courage. The next morning I woke before my alarm, something that almost never happened. Linda's words had followed me into my dreams, refusing to let me hide behind excuses any longer. I realized I had spent months believing that patience alone would solve everything, when in reality, I had been waiting for courage to arrive on its own. It never does. Courage only appears after someone chooses to move first. I finished my deliveries earlier than expected that afternoon and drove straight to Noah's house. His truck was gone, and a handwritten note taped to the front door explained that he had been called to help with a community safety event at the neighborhood park. I smiled to myself. Of course he had. If there was an opportunity to help people, Noah always seemed to find it. When I reached the park, families filled the walking paths while children rode bicycles through a small obstacle course set up by volunteers. Noah stood near one of the booths, laughing with a little boy who proudly showed off a bright orange bicycle helmet. Watching him from a distance reminded me of the first time I had seen him outside his uniform at the community center. Back then I thought I had discovered a different side of him. Now I understood that kindness had always been the real person, and the badge was simply one part of his life. He noticed me before I could decide what to say. His smile appeared instantly, though I could still see the uncertainty behind it. I was not expecting you, he admitted as he walked over. Neither was I answered honestly. Can we take a walk when you finish here? About 20 minutes later, we found ourselves following the familiar trail beside the river where so many of our conversations had taken place. The autumn air carried the scent of wet leaves, and sunlight reflected softly across the water. For several minutes, we walked without speaking. This time, the silence did not feel comfortable. It felt unfinished. Finally, I stopped walking and turned toward him. I have been thinking about Seattle all week. Noah looked down before meeting my eyes again. So have I. I took a slow breath. I told you that you should take the promotion if it was what you wanted. That was only half the truth. He waited quietly. The other half is that I was afraid to tell you I did not want you to leave. His expression softened, but he still remained silent, giving me space to continue. I spent so much of my life convincing myself that expecting less would protect me from disappointment. Then you came along and started believing in me before I even believed in myself. Somewhere between coffee, woodworking, volunteering, and all those ordinary Wednesdays, you became the person I look for first whenever something good happens. And honestly, I laughed nervously. Whenever something bad happens too. Noah let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like relief. Ethan, he said softly. I kept hoping you would say something like that because I was too scared to say it first. We both laughed, surprised by how much worry had been created by two people trying to protect each other. He looked across the river before continuing. When they offered me the promotion, everyone assumed the decision would be easy. Better title, better pay, new responsibilities. On paper it looked perfect, but every time I imagined leaving, I realized I was measuring my future by everything I would lose instead of everything I might gain. I shook my head gently. I do not want to be the reason you give up your career. You are not, he replied immediately. I called my captain yesterday. I blinked. You did? He nodded. I asked whether there would be opportunities for advancement here in Portland later on. He told me there probably would be. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. I stared at him. So, he smiled, this time without hesitation. I turned Seattle down. For a moment, I could not find any words at all. The weight that had settled over both of us during the past week simply disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. We continued walking until we reached a small wooden bench overlooking the river. As we sat down, Noah looked at me with the same calm honesty that had defined every important conversation we had shared. I do not know exactly what this becomes, he admitted. I only know that every ordinary day is better when you are part of it. I smiled because I had been feeling exactly the same way for months. Without rushing anything, I reached over and gently took his hand. He looked down for a brief second before intertwining his fingers with mine. It felt natural, comfortable, and completely unforced, as though we had simply arrived at a place both of us had been walking toward all along. The river continued flowing beside us. Families laughed somewhere farther down the trail, and the world carried on exactly as it always had. Yet somehow everything had changed, not because of one dramatic moment, but because two ordinary people had finally found the courage to stop hiding behind their fears and start choosing each other instead. 1 year later, the first thing people noticed when they walked into Brooks Woodworks was the long walnut dining table near the front window. It was never for sale. Families gathered around it during local charity events. Neighbors shared coffee there on Saturday mornings, and children from the community center proudly displayed small woodworking projects they had built with their own hands. Every scratch on its surface told another story, and I had stopped trying to keep it perfect because I finally understood that the most meaningful things in life were meant to be lived with instead of protected from every flaw. The restaurant project had grown into several new commissions, then into recommendations from satisfied customers, and eventually into the workshop I had dreamed about since I was a teenager. I still worked harder than I ever imagined, but the difference was that every exhausting day now carried purpose. Some afternoons Noah stopped by after finishing his shift, still wearing his uniform, carrying 2 cups of coffee exactly the way he had done during those first months when I barely believed in myself. He always claimed he was only checking whether I had remembered to eat lunch, although both of us knew he simply liked ending his day there. The volunteers from the community center visited often as well. Linda insisted on bringing homemade cookies every Friday, and the children proudly called the workshop their favorite field trip because they knew I would always let them sand a small piece of scrap wood before leaving. Watching them reminded me of something Noah had once said. Kindness had to be practiced every day. Looking around the workshop, I realized that was exactly what everyone there had been doing without ever announcing it. My relationship with Ryan slowly changed too. Instead of questioning my decisions, he started stopping by on weekends to help install shelving or unload lumber deliveries. One afternoon, he stood in the middle of the shop, looked around at the humming equipment and stacks of finished tables waiting for customers, then laughed quietly. "I spent years trying to convince you to give this dream up," he admitted. "I am glad you were stubborn enough not to listen." I smiled because hearing those words no longer felt like winning an argument. It felt like healing something that had remained broken for far too long. Noah and I never rushed our relationship. We kept building it the same way I built furniture, one careful piece at a time. There were ordinary grocery runs where we debated which apples made the best pie, quiet evenings reading separate books on opposite ends of the couch, long walks beside the river after difficult workdays, and lazy Sunday mornings when pancakes somehow became an all-morning event because we talked more than we cooked. Those ordinary moments became the strongest part of our story because they reminded us that love was not measured only by unforgettable milestones. More often, it revealed itself through consistency, patience, and showing up again the next day. Every now and then someone at the workshop would ask how Noah and I first met. We usually exchanged the same amused glance before I answered. It is a longer story than you would expect. Noah always laughed because he knew exactly which parts one left out. I never mentioned how embarrassed I had felt that rainy night, and he never mentioned that he had almost followed standard procedure instead of listening to his instincts. We both understood that a single choice made with compassion had quietly redirected 2 completely different lives. One evening, after closing the workshop, we carried takeout containers to the old walnut table by the front window. Rain tapped gently against the glass, almost exactly the way it had the night I first stayed at Noah's house. He looked around the room before smiling. "Do you remember telling me you wanted to build tables where families would make memories?" I nodded. "Looks like you finally did." I glanced around at the photographs customers had mailed us over the past year. Birthday dinners, holiday meals, graduation celebrations, new babies sitting in high chairs beside handcrafted tables that would probably outlast all of us. Then I looked back at Noah. "I think I built something even more important." He tilted his head with quiet curiosity. I reached across the table and took his hand, just as naturally as breathing. I found the person I wanted sitting across from it. He smiled with the same gentle warmth that had first surprised me so many months earlier, and for a while neither of us spoke. We simply watched the rain together, grateful for the ordinary peace we had once believed belonged only to other people. Sometimes I think back to the man I used to be, convinced that one bad night had defined him. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I would tell him that life has a remarkable way of hiding hope inside unexpected moments. A stranger's kindness can become a lifelong friendship. A simple conversation can become the beginning of trust. An ordinary day can quietly become the one that changes everything. Home, I eventually learned, is not measured by an address, a mortgage, or the walls surrounding you. Home is the place where someone believes in your future before you can see it yourself, where your ordinary days become your favorite memories, and where you never have to earn the right to be welcomed back. Looking across the table at Noah, I finally understood that I had not just rebuilt an old dream. Together, we had built a life.